Well, David Roach, Quantum Strategy, and all my worthy team. You're probably on your way back to the torture of your daily labor from what I hope was a well-earned vacation. And if you weren't, then my commiserations. I thought it is probably a good moment to go through some of the factors I think might be useful to remind you to think about if you need any reminding. Uh, Concerning the performance of markets to the end of this year, let us say. First of all, I think the general background is that the Fed, for reasons which I don't agree with, will cut interest rates in September. And I think this is the start of an unwarranted series of interest rate cuts, which is partly the result of the pressure of the administration on the Fed, but it is also the part of a misdiagnosis of the Fed concerning whether tariffs are of longer negative effects or simply a passing cloud over the face of the sun. And the Fed thinks they're all temporary, and I think that is wrong. The Fed has also interpreted the labor markets in a way which I think is not warranted, saying that the supply of labor will stabilize, but the demand for labor will go down, and therefore there will be increased unemployment. Now, first of all, you have to say that increased unemployment is from a level of 4.2%, 4.3% of unemployment, which is really full employment for that economy, and a full 200 basis points below what we get in Europe. But nevertheless, the pain threshold being very low, any drop in employment and rise in unemployment is not something the Fed is prepared to put up with. So I think we're going to get lower interest rates, which will sustain risk assets, but it will not do very much for your bond portfolios because the world is going to worry about tariffs not being as temporary as the Fed wishes to think, and inflation rates going higher because rates have been cut too soon. And of course, you have tremendous fiscal push and deficit spending for the US government. So I don't expect the sustaining of equity valuations for a while. I don't expect that to be anything which is going to influence bond rates much. And I think long bond rates are going to go up, even if short bond rates are deemed to be held steady by the Fed, which means the yield curve will steepen. Where you will really see damage and continue damage for this and other reasons is in the US dollar. The ECB is not going to cut for the moment, at least. And therefore, you're going to see the dollar weaken on the basis of the differentiation between interest rates in the United States at the short end and interest rates elsewhere, such as Europe, at the short end. So this is bad news for the dollar. Now, let us go on to some of the risk factors I think you have to keep in mind. The longer term risk factors, which I'll deal with first, are three. Number one, Putin's ability to manipulate Trump has been proven to be absolute. But they are also contradictory. They can't go on forever because ultimately Trump has to make up his mind whether he's going to accept the constant of Putin's war or whether he's going to revolt against Putin's control of him. If he goes on accepting Putin's justifications for war and abandons the cause of Ukraine and therefore the cause of Europe, you are ultimately going to look at a blow up between Europe and the US administration. That cannot be avoided. It can be plumaged, it can be manipulated, it can be disguised, it can be denied, but the reality is that contradiction is there. And when it blows up, if it blows up, that will be a major blow to NATO and will result in, I think, a different perspective altogether for risk assets on a global basis. And I would expect that at that point, you will see a rise in risk premiums, in risk assets, in particular in equities, and of course in European equities too. So I think you want to bear that in mind. Of course, it may come to the fact that for some reason or another, Trump does turn on Putin and say, well, I'm being manipulated, I'm not happy. You've been playing me along. And then he continues to impose assets on the unfortunate users of Russian oil like India. But it may well spread at that point to China. And if it does, those sort of secondary tariffs are going to become a big economic effect, a big economic factor, quite likely before the end of this year. So you have a binary situation on Trump, and I don't think that is neutral for markets for the reasons I've just given. The second big issue, I think, is this question of tariffs. There are two things we don't know about tariffs yet. Number one is the economic effects, the slowdown, and the inflation effects. And number two is whether those effects, when they happen, which they will happen, will be temporary or permanent. Now, I'll give it to you straight. I think that you have to look beyond tariffs to what is really happening here, which is that you are replacing the globalized economic system, which is very efficient, if rather heartless. You're replacing it with a nationalistic mercantile system, which is inefficient and will result in higher inflation, lower growth, etc. So that's the story behind the tariffs. I think it is impossible that you can replace system A with system B, the efficient with the inefficient, and say that the effects are temporary. I think the very process of replacing one system with another is 5 years, maybe 10. But the effects of doing so will be felt for the entirety of that period. So I think that is where the Fed and indeed the consensus of political economic thinking at the moment has got it completely and utterly wrong. I lay my head on the table. You can chop it off when I'm wrong. Humility is a part of this business. The third long-term risk, which I want to bring to your mind, is a gradual but nevertheless a big one, which is the loss of US power. Anybody who cooperates in international arena with the US at the moment does so because of coercion, not because they love the US. So if you replace the international relations with the sort of relationship which is driven by fear and hate, as opposed to shared values, you cannot pretend that the same thing now exists as existed before. Now, what does that actually mean? In concrete terms, it means the rise of the global south. You can call it BRICS, you can call it the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you can call it what you like, but there is no doubt that you have now the rise of agreement and shared values, despite their many disputes between China, India, and other countries like Brazil and South Africa within the BRICS organization. To say that that is economically neutral, you have to go back to the time when the BRICS seemed to include countries with such disparate interests that there was no way they could actually forge a common economic agenda. Well, the cleverness of US policy is that they have changed all that. They have actually alienated both China, which really wants to replace the US in its economic sphere and, of course, in global power politics, and India, which has been, it sees, hit in the mouth by these tariffs for the secondary tariffs for using Russian oil, and that is demolished completely in a very nationalistic, anti-imperialistic kind of mindset and expression. It has really completely demolished relationships with the US. So what the US has actually done in this sphere, and I could point to a dozen of them, is by acting in this kind of peace through strength, if you want to call it that, but it really isn't, just the exercise of raw power and commercialism. What the US has achieved is not an increase in its power, but a huge decrease in its power. And it will work its way out through the global south, through the BRICS, in one very specific way. The US dollar's role as an international reserve currency and the currency of transactions of choice will be diminished. It will be diminished because there is now the political will to do so. And where there is a political will to do so, despite all the reams of documentation and learned academic studies that says that the US dollar can never be replaced as a global reserve currency, well, if the will is there, yes, it can. Not completely, but at least at the margin. And it is the margin that matters to the value of the US dollar. I can also give you economic reasons for that. If the US is going to have a smaller current account deficit, is going to be growing more slowly because that smaller deficit will be achieved by protectionism, which will damage the efficiency of the US economy. So growth will be slower, the current account deficit will be slower, which in a nutshell means that the US will be supplying less dollars to the global liquidity pool than it was when its current account deficit was higher. Now, the need for international currency, for international transactions, is not going to slow down just because the US does. In fact, it's going to probably accelerate as the BRICS get trade between themselves growing faster than any trade with the US. You can already see this in the Chinese growth figures for exports to the US compared to exports to the rest of the world. So the need for a reserve currency to fund that faster rate in growth, which binds together the BRICS, and indeed, I would suspect down the road, many other emerging market currencies, as well as developed ones like Europe, that need for additional currency will not be satisfied with the US. Therefore, arithmetically, you're going to see probably the renminbi become a serious reserve currency. And it could indeed stretch to the euro, which is already 20% of reserves, and so on. So that spells weakness for the dollar. Because if you reduce the role of the dollar as a reserve currency, even at the margin, you are reducing the need to hold dollars enormously at the core. Because the core holders of those US dollars are precisely the currencies which will now be using an alternative. That is China, India, South Africa, Brazil, etc. So baked in the cake in this risk factor, looking out further, is a weak US dollar, and you ain't seen nothing yet. You've seen a 10% devaluation of the dollar on a trade-weighted basis. Try 20 to 30. Okay, so all that's very academic and it's all long-term. So let's look at what's immediately facing you coming back. Well, the first thing that you have to talk about as an immediate risk is tariffs. Gosh, we've been talking about that. Why are we talking about it again? Well, we're talking about tariffs because the Court of Federal Appeal in the United States has ruled, like the Court of International Trade in the United States, International Commerce, has ruled that Trump's use of the IEEPA, the Emergency Powers Act, to enact tariffs was wrong, that it's illegal. That judgment will now go to the Supreme Court. If it is confirmed, it will mean that the entirety of Trump's foreign policy and foreign trade achievements, if I can put that in inverted commas, will fall to bits, because they all have emergency tariffs at some point in their mechanisms, in their components. So if the use of emergency powers, such as the IEEPA, are ruled to be illegal, then the alternatives to go back and get some other power to impose his tariffs will actually cripple Trump, because the other powers almost universally, with the exception of one, requires either the approval of Congress or the investigation by departments like Trade, Commerce, in order to justify those tariffs on a more scientific basis than what goes on in Trump's heart and soul. I wouldn't come out to say it was in his mind. That's a lengthy process, which will also be sectorial. Most of those alternative tariff powers focus on sectors where damage is deemed to being done to the United States interest, not upon countries as a whole. So I think that the replacement of the emergency powers as a basis for Trump's policies, trade policies, and indeed foreign policies, because they are so closely intermelded, I think that is going to be a very lengthy, clumsy process, which is going to mean that you virtually have to start from scratch on your ambitions about tariffs and trade and punishing all those evil countries which sold the United States all those nice goods that the US wanted to own. So if you do that, then the trade deals, the kind of handshake deals, like the one with Japan, like the one with Europe, which are not documented as proper trade deals, but are simply really statements of intent, in some cases common intent, but statements of intent. Those fall to bits but they could not be negotiated in the same shape again. Let me give you one example. If you go back to Europe and try to renegotiate the outright surrender, which as Ursula von der Leyen negotiated on behalf of the European states in her role as president of the European Commission, you could never do that again. It would simply be politically impossible. So when you actually look at what is actually happening, if it is confirmed that the use of emergency powers to pass tariffs was illegal in the United States, there is a lot more that falls to bits than simply the negotiations which are ongoing or in the future. It is actually everything that has been done. And the whole of the trade thing falls to bits, and the whole of the foreign policy thing falls to bits. Don't expect the markets to be neutral about that. But, and there is a big but, let us suppose it goes the other way. And the Supreme Court says, oh, well, everything those kind of lower judges say is always garbage. You can't do anything against the president's powers. And after all, the Supreme Court is stuffed with Trump appointees. Well, if they say that, then what will happen? And the answer is Trump will go absolutely wild. He will use emergency powers everywhere, and he will use emergency powers for anything. And therefore, you're going to see a plethora of new tariffs. Don't ever think the tariffs will not be central to Trump's thinking. And if the Supreme Court votes in his favor, it is not tariffs being central to Trump's thinking. It is tariffs being central to presidential hyperactivity. Hold on to your seat, because that is not neutral for global trade, economics, or markets. Okay, now two other things which are short-term risks, but they are important. Number one is France. Mr. Bayrou's budget. The French government is teetering on the brink of a no confidence vote of collapse on September the 8th. Do I think there will be new elections? And I think no, there will not, because it is not in the interest of the opposition parties to have new elections, because, to put it simply, most of them would get slaughtered. So no. And I think what is going to happen is that one of two things: either they will crack in their opposition to the budget, or the Prime Minister Bayrou will fall, and President Macron will find another kind of Macron stooge to put in the middle. But there will not be new elections. If there were new elections, I would be piling into short French treasuries, oats, 10 years. But I'm not. I think the long-term outlook for oats is very poor, because if you look at what the Bayrou budget does, is it takes 5 to 6% off government spending, but not by cutting government spending, by freezing it. And I think much more needs to be done on the reform side in France in order to get the French economy moving. So actually, what the Bayrou budget would do would be to lessen demand, and France would grow even more slowly than the miserable 1% it might possibly achieve in 2026. With the result that the government deficit will be higher anyway. The fact of the matter is that France spends 55% of GDP, other European countries spend below 50, and France has to get its act together and say this wonderful welfare state, and it is a wonderful welfare state, which we have created with high-speed trains and everything else, all of which are absolutely fantastic, but completely uneconomic. Then I'm afraid you can't afford them. And until France says, we can't afford this, then nothing is going to change. But it is not going to be a sovereign debt crisis now. So that's what I'm saying about France. And then on the Middle East, we have the snapback provisions of the JCPOA, the agreement whereby way back in 2015, I think, Iran got permission to do some international business, provided it repurposed its nuclear capacities to civilian use. Well, we all know what happened to that. A lot of things. But here we are today. The snapback, which will take effect in October, is essentially rolling back the 5 or 6 liberalizing measures which were enacted by the UN Security Council with the agreement of everybody back in 2015. So it basically puts back the restrictions which were lifted. Now, those restrictions are not going to affect the flow of oil. And it's not really affecting the flow of commerce. What it does is it stops the Iranians doing all the things they're supposed to be stopped anyway, which is like developing its nuclear power for in preparation for war or weaponry. It stops it trading uranium and that sort of thing, but it does not affect actually what matters to us in our greedy little world of portfolios. Oil unaffected. Therefore, the snapback, big political blow, diplomatic blow to Iran. Lots of politics involved, but not the sort of politics which incur a huge economic cost for portfolio managers. So that's it now. I thought I would try and get my little mind together so that you would have a coherent kind of global outlook at the opening of La Rentrée, comme on dit en France, the great return from what I hope were blue and yellow Ukrainian colored umbrellas on the beach to the gray skies of thrashing it out in international markets every day. Goodbye, good luck, and don't forget to turn off the lights.